Hey everyone, welcome back. You guys have sent in a ton of notes on economic development, and I am so ready to dig in. We're talking about Ireland's journey, economic growth,
hmm
globalization, trade, competitiveness, all that good stuff. It's like you basically dumped a whole economics course on my desk, and I am here for it.
Looking for the gold nuggets and all of that, right?
No, it is. So one thing that's got me thinking from these notes is this whole idea of economic growth versus economic development. Like, on the surface, they sound kind of similar, right? But our notes here are suggesting they're actually very different beasts.
Mm.
So for those of us who don't have PhDs in economics, can you break down the difference? Like, what's the big distinction and why should we care?
Well, it's more about transformation than just transactions, if that makes sense. Imagine like a small village that depends almost entirely on farming to get by. Now, fast forward, say, a decade, and picture that same village, but now it's a hub for tech startups and all these different businesses. That shift, going from just agriculture to a more diverse economy, that's development, not just growth. It's about a fundamental change in how a country actually functions and
So
operates.
it's like leveling up, not just gaining more XP.
Yeah, exactly. It's more than just bigger numbers.
But I'm guessing that kind of glow up doesn't just happen overnight. What are some of the challenges of making that leap?
Totally, yeah. Development doesn't always follow a clear, straight path. And it comes with a whole bunch of challenges that need to be tackled, like dealing with inequality, figuring out those environmental impacts, and even navigating cultural shifts. It's a balancing act for sure.
Speaking of balance, our notes keep mentioning these four imbalances that can seriously hold a country back. It all sounds a bit ominous, like something out of an economic horror movie, don't you think?
It's more like a detective story in my mind. We're just trying to piece together why some countries struggle to develop even though they're putting in the work. For example, imagine a country where most people are stuck in this cycle of subsistence farming, just barely getting by. They lack the resources, education, and opportunities to break out of that cycle. And that's what we're talking about when we say poverty trap, one of the biggest imbalances there is.
Wow, it's like being stuck in quicksand. The more you struggle to get out, the further down you sink.
Yeah, it can definitely feel that way. Then you have places with an abundance of natural resources, maybe even literally sitting on a gold mine. But often that wealth ends up concentrated in the hands of just a few, and you get these massive disparities in wealth, which often spills over into instability. And that's what we call economic dualism, another huge obstacle on the road to development.
And that brings us to, I think, a really interesting example, Ireland. Our notes were mentioning that way back when we were actually considered a less developed nation. So how did we break free from those economic traps? What's the secret sauce?
Well, if I had a magic formula, I wouldn't be here. But in all seriousness, I think there are some really good lessons to be learned from Ireland's journey. One of the biggest factors has been attracting foreign direct investment. Basically, you've got all these companies from all over the world coming here to set up shop, bringing with them capital, technology, and expertise that we might not have had otherwise.
Okay, hold up for a sec. I have a confession to make. Whenever I hear foreign direct investment, my brain kind of just checks out.
Yeah, it's not exactly the most exciting term, is it?
So can you break it down for me? Like, what is it really, and why is it such a big deal for a country that's trying to develop?
Okay, so imagine you've got a killer business idea, but you need an investor to give you some cash to get it up and running. So you pitch it to them, they see the potential, and they decide to back you. Now just replace you with Ireland and investor with like a big multinational corporation. That's foreign direct investment in a nutshell. A company that basically sees a country's potential and invests in it. But they're not just buying stocks. They're building factories, creating jobs, and pumping money into the local economy.
Right. So it's more of a long-term commitment. It's not just about a quick buck. It's about
Yeah.
trying to build something that will last, that will hopefully bring jobs and prosperity for years to come.
Exactly. It's all about fostering that growth.
So what is it about Ireland that attracts these investors?
Mm.
Because clearly it's working.
Well, a lot of it comes down to creating a business-friendly environment. Things like low corporate taxes, having a young and educated workforce. And of course, don't underestimate the benefits of being part of the EU single market. That gives businesses instant access to this massive customer base.
It's like having a giant open for business sign flashing, right? And speaking of being open for business, our notes mention that Dublin was recently ranked as the #1 city in the world for attracting foreign direct investment. Now, that's got to be a pretty big deal. What makes Dublin so special?
Well, one thing that really stands out is Dublin's young and highly skilled workforce, which is a huge draw for industries like tech and pharmaceuticals that really rely on innovation. Plus, you can't discount the luck of the Irish, right? Dublin's known for its warm and welcoming culture, which makes it a pretty attractive place for international companies to set up shop.
So it's not just about the bottom line. It's about creating an environment where both businesses and people can thrive. Okay, so our notes also mention something called invisible exports, which sounds like something straight out of a spy movie to me, but I have a feeling it's probably a bit more boring than that. What exactly are invisible exports and why are they so important for Ireland's economy?
Well, think about the last time you listened to a U2 album or used any software developed in Ireland. Those are invisible exports in action. Basically, they're services, not physical goods, that bring in revenue for Ireland without anything actually leaving the country.
So it's like we're exporting brain power and creativity.
Exactly. And those invisible exports, along with the more traditional exports of goods, all factor into a country's balance of payments.
Ah, yes, the balance of payments, a term that can strike fear into the heart of even the most seasoned economist. Can you give us the layman's explanation of what the balance of payments is and why it matters?
Think of it like your own personal budget, just on a much larger scale.
Mhm.
It tracks all the money coming into and going out of a country from things like trade, investments, even tourism. And if a country is spending way more than it's earning, that's a recipe for economic instability.
So it's like a financial checkup for a whole country. A healthy balance of payments means the economy's in good shape.
Precisely. Just like you'd check your bank balance before splashing out on something big, economists and policymakers keep a close eye on a country's balance of payments to gauge its overall economic health.
And speaking of the global economy, let's talk about international trade. It's this giant web where countries are constantly buying and selling from each other. What are the big ideas driving this global exchange? And is it really as mutually beneficial as everyone says it is?
A lot of it boils down to this concept of comparative advantage. Imagine you're amazing at baking cakes but can't sew a button to save your life, and your friend is a master tailor but wouldn't know where to start with a cake. It makes more sense for you to focus on baking, your friend to handle the tailoring, and then you just swap. But
Right.
so instead of each of us ending up with a mediocre cake and a shirt hanging by a thread, we play to our strengths and both come out ahead. Makes sense. So why all the fuss about protectionism then? If trading is supposed to be this win-win, why are some countries so keen on limiting it with things like tariffs and quotas? Because it's not always as simple as it sounds. In theory, yeah, free trade sounds great, but in the real world, there are almost always winners and losers. Certain industries and workers might really struggle to compete with cheaper imports from other countries.
Like trying to protect that local bakery from being put out of business by some giant corporation.
Exactly. And that's where protectionism comes in. Governments can use tariffs, which are basically taxes on imported goods, to make those imports more expensive and less competitive. Or they might set quotas, which limit how much of a certain good can be imported.
It's a tough balancing act, though. You want to protect your own industries and workers, but too much protectionism can stifle competition and innovation.
You've got it. It's about finding that sweet spot between looking after your own interests and reaping the benefits of global trade. And I think the whole Brexit saga is a perfect example of how tricky that can be.
Oh yeah, Brexit. All those predictions of economic doom and gloom.
Mhm.
But our notes actually suggested it hasn't been all bad news. Like, the UK's GDP per capita has held up pretty well compared to other big economies.
It just goes to show economics is rarely black and white. The impact of something like Brexit is always going to be complicated. While there have definitely been some challenges, I think it's still too early to say for sure what the long-term effects will be.
It's like a giant economic chess game, and we're all still trying to figure out what the next move should be. Okay, shifting gears a little bit here. Our notes touch on a topic close to my heart: fair trade. I love the idea of a fairer deal for producers, especially in developing countries. But I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure how it all works. Could you break it down for us? Does buying fair trade actually make a difference?
Imagine you're at a farmer's market and see two stalls selling coffee beans. One is from a huge corporation, the other from a small cooperative of farmers who are getting a decent price for their beans. Which one would you go for?
Honestly, probably the one from the cooperative, even if it meant spending a little bit more, knowing that my purchase is going directly towards supporting those farmers in their communities.
Exactly. And that's what fair trade is all about, giving consumers the power to make more ethical choices that benefit both the people producing the goods and the environment. It's about making sure farmers and workers, often organized in cooperatives, are getting a fair price for their products.
So it's about leveling the playing field a bit, giving those smaller producers a fighting chance.
Absolutely. Fair trade often involves setting minimum prices for certain goods, like coffee or cocoa, to protect farmers from sudden price crashes. It also promotes better working conditions and encourages more sustainable farming practices.
It's good to know that even in this massive system of global trade, there are initiatives out there trying to make it a bit fairer for everyone. Now, things take a bit of a strange turn in our notes when we get to Zimbabwe and this whole thing about a loaf of bread costing billions. That sounds insane. What's the story there?
Yeah, it sounds made up, doesn't it? But it all comes down to this thing called exchange rates. You know, like when you travel to a country with a different currency, you
Right.
have to exchange your money.
Yeah,
And that's basically the exchange rate in action, how much of one currency you get for another.
totally. Like when I went to Europe last year, I was constantly checking those currency converter
Yeah.
apps, hoping the exchange rate would magically work out in my favor.
Exactly. So imagine if that exchange rate went totally out of whack.
Oh, no.
That's what happened in Zimbabwe. Due to a whole bunch of factors like economic mismanagement and hyperinflation, their currency basically collapsed.
Mm.
It got so bad that people literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy everyday things.
Wow, it really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? It's easy to forget that economic stability isn't just some abstract concept. It has a real impact on people's lives,
Absolutely.
and it makes you appreciate the importance of having sensible economic policies in place
For sure.
and competent leaders, might I add.
Yeah, that doesn't hurt either.
And of course, let's not forget about all those global institutions we hear about all the time, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization.
Right.
They may not always get it right, but they do provide some kind of framework for cooperation and, ideally, stability in the global economy, don't they?
Yeah, for sure. It's like having a global safety net or maybe even a team of referees trying to keep things fair and prevent those total economic meltdowns.
Exactly. They're not perfect by any means, and there's always going to be debate about their role. But it's important to have them, right?
Definitely, yeah.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from coffee beans to silicon chips, from the streets of Dublin to, well, the economic roller coaster that is Zimbabwe. If you had to sum it all up, what would be the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest thing is just understanding that economics, at its core, is about people, right? It's about how we organize ourselves, how we make decisions, and how those decisions ultimately impact our lives and the world around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, there you have it. Another deep dive successfully completed. I hope you found this one as fascinating as I did.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our amazing listeners, thanks for joining us on this wild ride through the world of economics. Remember, keep asking those tough questions, stay curious, and we'll catch you next time.